a waiting period for the right moment of incarnation. Now on the earth, and we have kindergarten teachers here, so you tell this story much better than I will. But when the intercourse takes place, it is as though a space is opened in the physical world for that spirit germ to descend in. It slips out of the hands of the soul into the womb of the mother, and an incredible longing overtakes the soul. It has already formed an astral body, but now it needs the etheric forces to build up that physical body. So this longing is what allows that soul to call forth the etheric forces that then begin to weave into this earth matter and bring life into this spirit germ from the physical world. The descent of that spirit germ occurs exactly 18 days after conception. The phase of the moon at that point will be the same phase of the moon that the soul is then born into the earth and into life on. So there will be 10 lunar cycles. So just for the sake of ease, let's say that the moon was new at that point. 10 new moons later, the child will be born. Now there are intervening circumstances that can prevent that from happening that way, but that's the natural rhythm. So you can imagine it then that during each of these 10 lunar cycles, during the gestational period, the soul is gathering the cosmic forces that strengthen the etheric body that is then the life when it's unfolding on the earth. Each one of those 10 lunar cycles takes 7 years at a time. So this is close relationship between Saturn and the moon. So it's 10 lunar cycles during the gestation, and then there are about 10 7-year cycles in the space of the average human life. So about 70 to 72 years. This is not a haphazard random number. It's based on the precession of the sun. It's kind of heady, but it's going to make sense in just a moment. So the sun comes to its starting point every year. It seems to go around us, but it comes to its starting point slightly earlier every year. 1/72 of a degree earlier every year. After 72 years, the sun has precessed 1 full degree of the zodiac. If you do the math, you find out that it takes 25,000, almost 26,000 years for the sun to precess all the way through and come back to where it began. But after 72 years, what Rudolf Steiner says is that from birth until that point, when a human soul, a human being is born on the earth, the sun takes up our relationship for us to our star. But after 72 years, the sun moves on, and we come into direct relationship with our star, and we can be called back. Not everybody will live 72 years. Some will live fewer years, some will live more years. But that's a completion of the normal life force. I don't know if that's the right word, but that's the rhythm of it. So this idea that from birth to 7, we're working out 1/4 of the Saturn cycle, 7 to 14, 14 to 21, 21 to 28. This is the Saturn rhythm. But then also, each one of those 7-year cycles belongs to the planetary spheres. So birth to 7 is referred to as the moon sphere. So if you imagine that we came through Saturn, then through Jupiter, then Mars, coming toward the Earth, then we do the same thing in reverse. So coming in and then unfolding back out. So the last place that we were becomes the first place that we experience. So we live within the consciousness of the moon sphere for the first 7 years. Now, it took me a long time to figure out what the heck does that mean? And as I understand it, when you look at the consciousness of a child, everything that can enter their sphere of consciousness is what lives within the sphere of the moon, not beyond that, but everything that's within that. And then we move on. And actually we move into something that's kind of confusing because 7 to 14 is referred to as the Mercury sphere. In the 1600s, Mercury and Venus had their names switched. I'm not going to go into that right now, but it could be that Mercury sphere at that point is referring to the planet that we know as Venus, because it's the next closest thing after the moon. Earth to 7 is the moon sphere, 7 to 14 is Mercury, 14 to 21 is Venus. Then there are 3 octaves of the sun, 21 to 28, 28 to 35, 35 to 42. This is the peak of the fertility. And then, the peak of the physicality in the life cycle. At 42, one enters the Mars sphere. So 42 to 49. One is in the Mars sphere. And this is oftentimes referred to as a period of crisis. This crisis, 42 to 49, is Mars. If I need to slow down, I will.
Can you go back to what the other spheres are called?
So, Earth to 7 is moon.
You can use
and all the way to Venus. I'm sorry.
Venus, and then I said there are 3 octaves of the sun.
I'm
So
sorry, I don't want to slow you down.
That's okay. 21 to 28 is the first sun octave, and 28 to 35 is the sun again, and 35 to 42 completes the sun cycle. And then 42 to 49 is Mars. 49 to 56 is Jupiter, 56 to 63 is Saturn, and then from 63 to about 70, we're beginning to have this relationship with our star. Kind of a resolution in the feeling life of the karma and the destiny. So it doesn't end after that, but I suspect that the relationship to the influences of the planets and the stars at that time changes. Now, in the Mars sphere, there can be a crisis. So you have to imagine it that from birth to 42, we are going toward the sun, which we consider the center of our particular planetary system. But then from 42 on, we're going toward the planets that are beyond the Earth relative to the sun. And our relationship now is toward our own star. Rather than the sun, that all of humanity holds as the center, we have to find our individual star. And that can cause a crisis. It can be very upsetting. There's a lot of other planetary aspects that happen during that time, but also it's in the Mars sphere where there's this challenge to the human being about the relationship to the spiritual world. And from 49 to 56, we begin 56 to 63 Saturns are gone way further and more into detail than I wanted to on that subject. But so right now, in the cycle of the year, we are in the end of the winter, and we come to spring equinox on March 20th. Until about 2007, spring equinox happened on March 20th and March 21st. But from now until about 2044, spring equinox will happen only on the 20th of March, and then it will begin to happen on the 19th. This, again, is because of the precession. So the equinox is the point when the sun crosses the celestial equator, which is an imaginary line. We have to put ourselves at the center. And finding the center and finding ourselves at the center is a very important exercise now, especially because in the world of astronomy, astronomers say things like, well, there's a black hole at the center of every galaxy, or there are planets orbiting every star in our system. Or a couple weeks ago, they said there was a solar eclipse. And I said, there wasn't a solar eclipse. Well, there was a solar eclipse if you were on the International Space Station. So it's always pulling the human being off the center, off of being central. And this, of course, happened to greatest influence in the 15 and 1600s when Nicholas Copernicus introduced the idea that the Earth was not at the center. And then, about 100 years later, when Galileo first used his telescope to look into the night sky and confirmed this, that Copernicus was saying, the idea really began to take hold. And in the lectures that are included in the book, The Secret Stream, by Rudolf Steiner, he talks about this, that this Copernican thought was the last act of Lucifer against the human being, that it was the slaying of Isis. So just as Osiris was slain and cast into the earth, his body dismembered and cast into the earth, and Isis has to go about the community and gathering the pieces of his body to put it back together. She doesn't only gather the pieces of his body, but depending on which piece of the body different communities had, she would teach ritual and ceremony. So if you had the left foot, you did a certain type of ceremony as opposed to having the right arm. So depending on which part of the body the community had, they would do ceremony, and in that way, all of Egypt was involved in embodying Osiris through ritual and ceremony. Then Rudolf Steiner goes on to say that Isis is slain, so Osiris is slain by Typhon Arma, but Isis is slain by Lucifer in the Copernican thought and cast into the cosmos and remains in her grave there when we only think about the cosmos through celestial mechanics and modern astronomical thought, which is just weight and number and measure and chemicals in the atmosphere that make up the spherical bodies. I have put forth the idea that in 2006 the Copernican revolution was fulfilled when the International Astronomers Union got together in Prague to settle the question of what is a planet. Part of what motivated this was that they were discovering other things out near the planet Pluto, that if Pluto was a planet, so were these other things, so we had to add a bunch of stuff to our planetary system, or had to determine that Pluto was not a planet, which meant that none of these other things were either. At this conference, they came up with a definition of what is a planet. So at the time of Copernicus, it's, okay, three things. The Earth is rotating on its axis. As it's rotating on its axis, it's orbiting the sun. But as it's orbiting the sun, it remains parallel to its own axis, which means that as it's going around, so this is the sun at the center, and here's the Earth, and here's its axis, it stays parallel to its axis. It doesn't just bow down to the sun at every point. Rudolf Steiner says that this is very, very important. This third element of what Copernicus said oftentimes gets pushed under the table, which means that's the thing to pay attention to.
Yeah.
And I think that this is the way the I being is safeguarded. Because even though the Earth was moved off center and says, okay, now it's going around the sun with all of the other planets, it doesn't lose its individuality. It stays kind of sovereign, is the way I think about that. But what happens in this, it's kind of a crisis in consciousness. The human being is pushed off center. But it wasn't a question before Copernicus about what was physically at the center. The understanding was that the Earth, with the human beings on the Earth, was central to a living cosmos. When this thought comes along that the Earth is not the center, or central to the attention of the cosmos, just looking at what's physically central, then you have the beginning of the physical sciences and the beginning of the end of understanding our relationship to a living cosmos. This is the grave of Isis. The Egyptians said that Isis, her restoration star Sirius, which we looked at tonight. It's the brightest star in our night sky. She's quite close to the constellation Orion, which was regarded as Osiris in Egyptian culture. So in the 1500s, 1600s is the first moving off center that happens. And now, in 2006, when the International Astronomers Union said, okay, let's define what is a planet, I really think that this kind of signaled an end of this thinking. Because it was first moving from the Earth being central to now the Earth is moving, and now we have to figure out, well, what is Earth? And they come to a very lifeless definition of what is Earth. If you look at the Wikipedia, for instance, about the definition that the International Astronomers Union came up with, it was that a planet must be orbiting the sun, it must have enough mass to sustain a spherical form, so it has to be round, and it has to be, it has to clear everything in the path of its orbit. So it can't cross the orbit of another planet. Now Pluto does that. It takes Pluto almost 280 years to go around the sun, but for 20 years, it's inside the orbit of Neptune, so it's actually closer to the sun than Neptune is, and it was from about the late 1970s into the 1990s. So Pluto, because of that definition, Pluto got demoted. There were a lot of other more technical things involved as well, but I really think that that's kind of the end of, I've gotten all the way to being able to define what is a planet physically. Now we have to begin to look again, I mean as a humanity, to look again at what is our relationship to what's out there? And what the astronomical community gives us is, well, there's a black hole at the center of every galaxy, and there are planets orbiting every star that we see in our galactic system. These things are off our center. So part of the work, I believe, of astrosophy and the star knowledge now is to rediscover the center. Rediscovering the center means recognizing that it's not a physical point in space. That's what we get from Copernicanism, that we have to look at what's physically at the center. So rather than looking at the physical point in space, we could consider that the center is a moment in time, and that everything in our system, in our galaxy, perhaps even in our universe, has its moment at the center. And I'm going to draw a picture and put before you the idea that the Earth comes to the center every year. And that is when the deep mystery, cosmic mystery that Rudolf Steiner describes, the mystery of Golgotha, takes place on the Earth. That is when we are central. And it's an event that you can only find if you know the relationship between the sun and the moon and the Earth, and where they are relative to one another in the cosmos, so that that can take place. So I'll try to draw this as best I can, and if you have any questions, just stop and ask. I'm not going to draw a perfect circle, but I'm going to give it my best shot. So, human being on the Earth. So we have to imagine, rather than having this abstract thought, we all know that we're moving, but that the sun rises and the sun sets. It appears to us that the sun comes up in the east, moves overhead, sets in the west. We still give the verb to the sun. The one that's moving and acting is the sun, not the Earth. We don't see the Earth is turning away from the sun right now. So we still have to take a step in our consciousness. And with Copernicanism, what we have is the beginning of things not being as they seem, which opens the door for abstract thinking. And then a host of other things. But it's really very subtle. We take it so for granted now. And it's really important in dealing with a child that we recognize the effect that that can have. I remember when I was in 5th grade and I was told that the Earth was moving, and I went home and I asked my mom, how can I tell? And she said, well, you can't tell because everything's moving at the same time. So in my mind, I thought that meant that everything turned upside down at the same time. And in order to see that happen, I was going to hang on to the end of my bed and watch my mailbox out my window at the end of my driveway and hold on so tightly that when everything else turned upside down, I wouldn't, so I could see that it was happening, to prove to myself that it was moving. It's a really hard concept when you're young, but it lives in our culture so deeply. So anyway, put ourselves beyond Copernicanism and say, okay, the human being on the Earth is at the center, and the sun appears to be going around us. I'm going to do this. Not bad. Clockwise. So this is the horizon line, or actually it's going to be the celestial equator. Who was it that told me they wanted to be on the equator? So I drew it right through the middle of the human being. So you can imagine this is the equator, but the Earth has its equator. It's an imaginary line that goes around the middle of the Earth. And in astronomy, you take that Earth equator and project it out onto an imaginary sphere. All the stars are in this sphere. And in order to spatially find yourself in the cosmos, you have to create these imaginary points of reference. So one of them is called the celestial equator. And it's just a projection of the Earth equator out onto the celestial sphere. But it's important in terms of understanding the cycle of the year. So we're moving this way, clockwise. This is what's above, this is below. So everything above the horizon has to do with spring and summer. Everything below is fall and winter. Now, when we come to the Easter festival, what's happening is the sun is rising up past this point of celestial equator. But Easter doesn't happen right at that moment. It has to wait the way Rudolf Steiner describes it. The right observer has to arrive to witness this. And that observer is the moon. And not just any old moon, it's the full moon. Because the moon is full when it's opposite the sun. So if the sun is above the celestial equator, and the moon is going to be full below the celestial equator, on the opposite side. So, from the time of autumn equinox, so we'll say this is fall over here, this is spring, I'm trying to not make this confusing. From the time, so when the sun is coming through summer, it peaks at summer solstice, then it moves back toward the celestial equator, and it crosses over that line in the fall. The first full moon after the sun crosses that point is going to be opposite, and it's above the celestial equator. So from fall equinox until spring equinox, end of September until the end of March, every full moon occurs in the northern celestial hemisphere, above the celestial equator. We actually have greater moonlight than we do sunlight during that entire period of time. Now, at spring equinox, when the sun comes above the celestial equator, every full moon from spring equinox until fall equinox, so from end of March till end of September, every full moon is below the celestial equator. So they actually change positions. It's as though during the winter months, the moon assumes the throne of the night sky and only acquiesces when the sun has come over the celestial equator and it comes full and finds itself below the celestial equator. This is an actual change of relationship that takes place. So the moon doesn't come to the same point or the same phase on the same day every year. It takes about 19 years for the moon to repeat the same phase. If it's new on November 1st, one year, it's going to take 19 years before it's new again on November 1st. Because of the rhythm of the way everything is working. So if you're making a calendar, such as the calendar of the soul, and you want to include the relationship between the sun and the moon in there, you have to republish it every single year, because you can't just put out there, okay, the moon was in Aries on that day this year, it's not going to be there again in the same spot the next year. It'll take 19 years before that happens again. And so what's happening then is that that first full moon after the sun comes across the celestial equator can either happen the very next day or a whole month later. Remember, was it last year or the year before that Easter was on the 23rd of April? That's because the moon was full right here, just before it dipped below the celestial equator. So it took an entire month for it to come back and be full below the celestial equator. That's why. Easter Sunday is the first sun day after the first full moon, after the sun has crossed the celestial equator. There's a lot of stuff that's in there, but it's important because we have to find this relationship. So, and it's this time between vernal full moon and Easter Sunday, and the time between vernal equinox and vernal full moon is a sacred period of time. The Sumerians referred to it as the vernal congress of the gods. The gods would gather after the vernal equinox, which during that time was occurring among the stars of Taurus, and they would make decisions about what needed to happen on the earth for humanity to live in harmony with all that had been created. And this would be scripted on mighty stone tablets and handed down to the earth. Nabu or Nidaba was the messenger that would carry these stone tablets to the earth, later associated with the star Aldebaran and Mercury as morning star. It seems to move around through history. Who becomes that messenger? This predates the story of Moses receiving the stone tablets with the Ten Commandments. Here's what thou must do in order to live in harmony with what has been created. So, the vernal congress of the gods was this period of time after vernal equinox and before the vernal full moon, where decisions were being made. The reason that this became important to me was not only because I was born at vernal full moon, But when you look at the anniversary of Rudolf Steiner's death day on March 30th of 1925, it was after vernal equinox, but before the vernal full moon. So it is a lovely imagination that he crossed into the spiritual world as this gathering was taking place, as a human being carrying into the spiritual world the experience of human life to that table that requires now the input of what the human being can bring. You perhaps have all heard the verse, "Stars spake once to man. It is world destiny that they are silent now. To be aware of this silence can be pain for earthly humanity. But in this silence there grows and ripens what man is speaking to the stars. To be aware of this speaking can be strength for spirit man." It's as though Rudolf Steiner spoke right at this gathering. I like to imagine it that way, that there's this period of time. And then there's the waiting for the full moon to occur so that the moon can acquiesce the position it has taken since the fall. It's not the sun marching in and saying, "Out of the way, I'm the boss now." It's waiting for the moon to recognize of itself, for the lunar forces to come full and realize that they're below or somehow have had to step down. For vernal full moon, so I like to think about that and get out of the way there. But this time then, so there's the vernal congress of the gods from vernal equinox to vernal full moon. But then the time from vernal full moon until Easter Sunday is once again a very sacred period of time. Because the lunar forces, there's a recognition, an understanding, a certain level of consciousness about being below the celestial equator. And I suggest to you that from that point of vernal full moon until dawn on Easter Sunday, the earth regains the center. In fairy tales, this is spoken of as the time when the castle that is east of the sun and west of the moon. Because the sun can set knowing that the moon will not regain dominion at that time. When the sun is setting in the west, the earth is east of the sun. And the full moon is rising in the east, and they're west of the moon. So at that point, the earth becomes the focus and the attention of a living spiritual cosmos once again, every year. So we do have these scientific concepts that come out of trying to understand our place physically, that we are not physically at the center, but from a perspective of trying to understand this as a living relationship, the earth becomes central to the attention of a living cosmos at that time, because that is when the mystery of Golgotha, the cosmic mystery that takes place on the earth, can actually occur. Right relationship between the sun and the moon. So I'm going to show you